Imagine this. You've just arrived in the United States, decided to take a stroll through a small town somewhere in Alabama or Arizona, and suddenly discover that local laws prohibit carrying ice cream in your back pocket, or that camels aren't allowed on highways, or that you can't play cards on Sunday. Sounds absurd, doesn't it? Like someone deliberately invented laws just to mock common sense. But here's the thing. Almost every such strange, seemingly idiotic law has a perfectly logical explanation. It's just that this explanation got stuck somewhere in the 19th century, while the law didn't. It continues to exist in modern legal codes like an archaeological artifact, a reminder of what America used to be 100, 150, or even 200 years long ago. The United States is unique from a legislative standpoint. There's no single set of rules for the entire territory. Each state, each county, sometimes even each city, has the right to create its own laws. And when you combine this with the fact that old laws are rarely repealed, they're simply buried under new ones, you get a legal system that's like a historical layer cake. At the bottom lie laws from the colonial era, then the Wild West period, then Prohibition, then the mid-20th century, and on top of all that, modern regulations. The result? A country where you can legally own a flamethrower in most states, but in some places, you can't sell a car on Sunday. Where you can buy a rifle without registration, but serving margarine instead of butter in a restaurant might be illegal. These aren't jokes or urban legends. These are real laws that remain on the books, gathering dust but never officially erased. So let's dive into the most bizarre American laws and figure out why they appeared in the first place. Because behind each strange prohibition lies a story. A story about people, problems, and the times when these laws actually made sense. A story about an America that no longer exists, but refuses to completely disappear from the legal record. Let's start with perhaps the most famous strange law. In several states, including Alabama, Georgia, and Kentucky, it's technically illegal to carry ice cream in your back pocket. At first glance, this is complete nonsense. Who even does that? Your ice cream would melt within minutes, ruin your pants, create a sticky mess, and make you look absolutely ridiculous. There's no practical reason anyone would want to carry ice cream this way. But here's the historical context that makes everything click into place. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, this law had absolutely nothing to do with hygiene, fashion sense, or dress codes. It was an anti-horse theft measure. Yes, you read that right. This bizarre-sounding law was designed to prevent people from stealing horses, one of the most serious crimes you could commit in that era. Back then, horses were expensive, valuable property. They were your primary means of transportation, your way of hauling goods to market, your farm equipment, and your connection to the outside world. A family's livelihood could depend on their horse. Stealing someone's horse wasn't just theft, it was potentially devastating to the victim. In some states and territories, horse theft was punishable by hanging. Courts took it seriously, and communities were vigilant about protecting their animals. But proving horse theft was difficult. If someone claimed the horse followed them home voluntarily, how could you prove otherwise? Horses don't testify in court. They can't tell the sheriff that they were kidnapped rather than choosing to follow someone down the road. Clever thieves figured out a trick that exploited this legal loophole. They'd put something sweet and tempting in their back pocket. Often ice cream, sugar cubes, molasses candy, or other treats. Then they'd walk past someone's horse, intentionally positioning themselves so the horse could smell the sweet treat. The horse, being an animal with simple motivations, would smell the sugar and follow the person carrying it. The beauty of this scheme, from the thief's perspective, was plausible deniability. They never touched the horse, they never used force or coercion. They never even called to the animal or gestured for it to follow. The horse just decided to follow them of its own accord. If caught, the thief could claim innocent surprise. "Officer, I was just walking home. This horse started following me. I had no idea it belonged to someone else. I was going to turn it in as a stray." This made prosecution nearly impossible. How do you prove criminal intent when the accused never laid a hand on the animal? How do you demonstrate theft when the horse appeared to follow voluntarily. Legislators closed this loophole by making it illegal to carry ice cream, sugar, or other horse-attracting sweets in your back pocket in places where horses were kept. The logic was simple. There's no legitimate reason to carry ice cream in your back pocket. If you're doing it near stables, hitching posts, or areas where horses are tied up, you're clearly up to something suspicious. The law gave police grounds to arrest potential horse thieves before they could complete their crime. If you were caught with ice cream strategically positioned in your pocket near someone's horse, you could be arrested on suspicion of attempted horse theft. The prosecution didn't need to prove you actually stole anything, just that you were clearly preparing to use a known theft method. Today, of course, horses are no longer the primary mode of transportation. Ice cream comes in sealed containers, not loose scoops that you'd slip into your pocket. Modern refrigeration means we don't carry ice cream around as a portable snack. And security cameras, vehicle registration, and modern law enforcement methods make livestock theft much easier to detect and prosecute. But the law remains. Nobody bothers to repeal it because nobody bothers to enforce it either. It just sits there in the legal code, a monument to a crime method that no longer exists, a solution to a problem that disappeared a century ago. In Nevada and Arizona, there are laws restricting camels on public highways. In some jurisdictions, camels are explicitly banned from roads. In others, they're subject to special regulations about licensing, restraint, or permitted hours of travel. This sounds like pure fantasy. When's the last time you saw a camel on an American highway? When would this law ever be relevant? But this law also has genuine, fascinating historical roots that take us back to one of the strangest experiments in American military history. In the 1850s and 1860s, the US Army conducted an initiative called the United States Camel Corps. The idea was actually quite logical. The American Southwest, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, is hot, dry, desert territory. The Army was expanding into these regions, establishing forts, surveying routes, and maintaining supply lines across hundreds of miles of harsh terrain. Horses and mules struggled in these conditions. They required substantial amounts of water, which was scarce in the desert. They tired quickly, in extreme heat. They needed frequent rest and considerable fodder. Supply trains moving across the Southwest were slow, expensive, and often suffered losses as animals died from heat, thirst, or exhaustion. Someone in the War Department had a brilliant idea: use camels. Camels were perfectly adapted to desert environments. They could carry heavy loads, up to 600 pounds or more. They could go days without water. They could eat sparse desert vegetation that horses wouldn't touch. They could handle temperature extremes that would kill other pack animals. And they were already used successfully for transportation in Middle Eastern and North African deserts. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis, yes, the future president of the Confederacy, approved the plan. Congress appropriated funding. In 1856, the US Navy ship Supply sailed to the Mediterranean and returned with 33 camels purchased from Egypt, Malta, and Turkey. A second shipment brought the total to about 75 camels. Along with the animals came experienced camel handlers, mostly from the Middle East, who taught American soldiers how to care for and work with the animals. The camels were stationed at Camp Verde in Texas and used for various military expeditions. They carried supplies across desert routes. They participated in surveying expeditions. They were tested in various military operations. And from a purely practical standpoint, the experiment was somewhat successful. Camels really did work well in the desert. They could go where horses couldn't, carry more, travel farther on less water, and handle the heat admirably. But there was a massive problem that the planners hadn't fully anticipated. American soldiers absolutely hated working with camels. The animals were stubborn and temperamental. They spit at handlers when annoyed. They had an awful smell that soldiers found unbearable. They made strange, disturbing noises. They required specialized knowledge to handle properly. And most importantly, they absolutely terrified horses and mules. Whenever camels appeared on roads or near military camps, horses would panic. They'd never seen or smelled anything like a camel. The strange appearance, unfamiliar scent, and odd sounds triggered flight responses in horses, causing them to bolt, throw riders, or refuse to move forward. Mule trains would scatter. Cavalry horses would become uncontrollable. This made it nearly impossible to use camels anywhere near conventional military operations. Civilian reaction was similar. When camel trains passed through towns or traveled on public roads, local horses would panic, causing accidents, property damage, and chaos. Settlers complained. Local authorities protested. The camels, through no fault of their own, were causing serious disruptions to normal transportation and commerce. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, the Camel Corps program was effectively abandoned. The army had more urgent priorities than experimental desert transportation. Some camels were sold to circuses, zoos, and private buyers. Others were auctioned off to mining companies. And many were simply released into the wild, allowed to wander free in the desert. For decades afterward, wild camels roamed the southwest. There are documented sightings of feral camels throughout the late 19th century. They'd occasionally wander into towns, appear on roads, or startle travelers crossing the desert. The last confirmed sighting of a wild descendant of the Camel Corps was in Texas in the early 1900s, though unconfirmed reports persisted for years afterward. During this period, when camels might actually appear on public roads, local authorities passed laws restricting or prohibiting camels on highways to prevent accidents and traffic disruptions. If a camel appeared on a main road and caused a horse-drawn wagon to crash, who was liable? If camels damaged property or caused public disturbances, who was responsible? These laws provided clear answers. Camels weren't allowed. Period. As with the ice cream law, the original problem has long since disappeared. There are no more wild camels wandering Nevada or Arizona, and nobody's importing new ones for transportation purposes. But the law remains, a quirky reminder of one of the most unusual experiments in American military history. In many American states, especially in the South and Midwest, there are laws prohibiting certain activities on Sundays. In some places, you can't buy alcohol on Sunday mornings. In others, you can't hunt. In some counties, you still technically can't play cards, dice games, or other forms of gambling on the Christian Sabbath. Some jurisdictions prohibit certain types of retail sales, restrict operating hours for businesses, or ban specific recreational activities. These are called blue laws, and their origins lie deep in America's Puritan heritage and the religious character of early colonial society. The early colonists who settled New England in the 1600s were deeply, intensely religious. Many were Puritans who had left England specifically to create communities based on their strict interpretation of Christianity. They believed Sunday, the Sabbath, the Lord's Day, should be devoted entirely to worship, rest, spiritual contemplation, and religious study. Any form of work, entertainment, commerce, or sinful activity on Sunday was seen as blasphemy, a violation of the fourth commandment, to remember the Sabbath day, to keep it holy. Original blue laws in colonial America were incredibly strict, far beyond what most modern people would tolerate. In colonial Massachusetts, you could be fined, put in the stocks, or even whipped for traveling on Sunday, unless it was to attend church. You couldn't cook elaborate meals. Food had to be prepared the day before. You couldn't engage in any business or commerce. You couldn't participate in sports or games. You couldn't engage in unnecessary conversation. In some communities, you could be punished for kissing your spouse in public on Sunday, for laughing during church services, or for allowing your children to play. These laws weren't just religious preference. They were enforced criminal statutes with real penalties. Church attendance was often mandatory. Town officials would patrol on Sundays, watching for violations. Neighbors would report each other for Sabbath breaking. The Puritans took their Sundays very, very seriously. The term blue laws possibly comes from the blue paper on which some early Connecticut laws were printed, though the etymology is disputed. Regardless of the name's origin, the concept was clear. Sunday was different, and the law would enforce that difference. As America developed through the 18th and 19th centuries and became more diverse, Religiously pluralistic and secular, most blue laws were gradually relaxed or repealed, but not all of them. Many states kept restrictions on Sunday alcohol sales, Sunday hunting, Sunday gambling, and Sunday commerce. The reasoning shifted over time from purely religious justification to a mix of religious tradition and practical public order concerns. For example, prohibiting Sunday alcohol sales was rationalized not just as keeping the Sabbath holy, but as reducing domestic violence and drunken disturbances on the day when families should be together. Banning Sunday gambling was presented as protecting workers from wasting their wages and as discouraging organized crime. Restricting Sunday commerce was framed as giving workers a guaranteed day off. Throughout the 20th century, blue laws were repeatedly challenged in court on the grounds that they violated the First Amendment's Establishment Clause, which prohibits government establishment of religion. In 1961, the Supreme Court ruled in McGowan v. Maryland that blue laws were constitutional if they served a secular purpose, like providing a uniform day of rest for workers, even if they had religious origins. This ruling allowed many blue laws to survive. Even today, you'll find counties where liquor stores must close on Sundays or can only open after noon. You'll find states where car dealerships can't operate on Sundays, often maintained by the dealers themselves, who appreciate having a guaranteed day off. You'll find jurisdictions where certain types of entertainment are restricted, where hunting is prohibited, or where retail stores face limitations on Sunday hours. These laws remain controversial. Critics argue they're thinly veiled religious impositions that favor Christianity over other religions and violate separation of church and state. Supporters argue they preserve valuable cultural traditions and protect workers from being forced to work 7 days a week in our non-stop economy. But whether you support or oppose them, blue laws are a direct line connecting modern America to its Puritan past. A reminder that the country's religious heritage continues to shape its legal landscape centuries later. In many cities across America, particularly in older municipalities that existed before automobiles, there are detailed laws about how and where you can park your horse. In some places, you must tie your horse to designated hitching posts using approved methods. In others, you can't leave your horse unattended on main streets for more than a certain period, usually 30 minutes to 2 hours. Some cities require horse owners to equip their animals with waste-catching devices, essentially horse diapers or collection bags, when in downtown commercial areas. There are regulations about how far apart horses must be tied to prevent them from fighting or bothering each other. Rules about providing water for horses left standing, restrictions on where horses can be ridden or driven, speed limits for horse-drawn vehicles, requirements for lighting on carriages at night, detailed specifications for the width of wagon wheels to prevent road damage. These laws date back to when horses were the primary, dominant mode of urban transportation. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, from roughly 1880 to 1920, American cities were absolutely packed with horses. They pulled carriages carrying passengers. They hauled wagons loaded with goods. They carried individual riders. They powered streetcars on rails. They were everywhere, constantly, in massive numbers. New York City alone had over 100,000 horses in 1900. London had around 50,000. Every major American city had thousands. Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, all had enormous horse populations. And this created problems on a scale that's difficult for modern people to fully appreciate. First, there was the manure problem. An average horse produces 15 to 35 pounds of manure per day, plus about a quart of urine. Multiply that by thousands of horses, and you have a serious public health crisis. Streets were literally covered in manure, sometimes several inches deep. In summer, it would dry and turn to dust, filling the air with particles that caused respiratory problems. When it rained, manure would turn to sludge, making streets nearly impassable and washing waste into water supplies. The manure attracted enormous numbers of flies, which spread disease. It created unbearable odors. It had to be removed constantly, creating an entire industry of street cleaners and manure collectors. Farmers would buy city manure for fertilizer. Despite these efforts, cities couldn't keep up. The great horse manure crisis of the 1890s saw urban planners genuinely worried that cities would become uninhabitable, buried under ever-growing mountains of horse waste. Second, there was the traffic problem. Horses move slowly. They need space. They can't navigate complex intersections efficiently. As cities grew denser, horse-drawn traffic became impossibly congested. Streets clogged with horses, wagons, and carriages. Accidents were common. Horses would bolt, causing crashes. They'd collapse from exhaustion, blocking traffic. They'd fight with other horses, creating disturbances. Third, there was the parking problem. Yes, parking has been an urban issue for far longer than cars have existed. Horses couldn't just be abandoned anywhere. They needed to be tied securely or they'd wander. They needed shade and water. They needed space so they wouldn't kick or bite other horses or pedestrians. They needed to be positioned so their manure wouldn't fall directly on sidewalks or storefronts. Cities responded with detailed, comprehensive regulations. Horses had to be parked in designated areas, tied to approved hitching posts using methods that kept them secure but didn't injure them. They couldn't be left unattended for long periods. You had to check on your horse regularly, provide water, and make sure it wasn't distressed. Horse owners had to clean up after their animals or face fines. Some cities required special manure-catching devices attached under the horse's tail, bags or containers that would collect waste before it hit the street. Others required horse owners to immediately shovel up any manure their animals produced. These regulations were as detailed and seriously enforced as modern parking regulations. When automobiles began replacing horses in the 1910s and 1920s, these problems rapidly disappeared. Cars didn't produce biological waste, just mechanical pollution, but that's a different issue. They were faster and more maneuverable. They could be parked more compactly. They didn't need food, water, or rest. The transition from horses to cars was shockingly fast. By 1920, horses had largely disappeared from major American cities. The infrastructure of hitching posts, water troughs, and stables was dismantled or repurposed, and the elaborate system of horse regulations became obsolete almost overnight. But many of these laws were never formally repealed. They just stopped being enforced as the problem they addressed vanished. They remained in legal codes, forgotten relics of the pre-automotive era. Occasionally, someone riding a horse through a modern city, perhaps for recreation, tourism, or as part of a historical reenactment, will discover these laws still exist. A police officer, half amused and half confused, will try to figure out whether the century-old regulations still apply what the fine should be and whether anyone even knows how to process a citation for improper horse parking in the 21st century. American bars are subject to some truly bizarre regulations that vary wildly from state to state and even from county to county. In some places, bars must serve food to sell alcohol, not just snacks, but actual meals that meet minimum nutritional requirements. In others, bartenders can't consume alcohol while on duty or even sit down during their shift. In Utah, bartenders must pour drinks below a barrier so customers can't watch the preparation. In Pennsylvania, you can't buy a six-pack of beer at the same place you buy wine or liquor. In some counties, bars can't have more than a certain number of bar stools or must maintain specific lighting levels. In Texas, buying alcohol before noon on Sunday requires purchasing food simultaneously. Most of these strange, seemingly arbitrary rules trace back to one of the most dramatic, transformative, and ultimately disastrous periods in American legal history: Prohibition. From 1920 to 1933, the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages were illegal throughout the United States under the 18th Amendment to the Constitution and the Volstead Act that enforced it. Prohibition was the culmination of decades of campaigning by the temperance movement, which blamed alcohol for a host of social problems: domestic violence, poverty, moral decay, crime, and family breakdown. Reformers believed that banning alcohol would create a cleaner, healthier, more moral society. Some states had already implemented their own prohibition laws before the federal amendment, but the 18th Amendment made it nationwide and constitutional. The result was a disaster that actually made many problems worse. Prohibition didn't stop people from drinking, it just made them drink illegally. Speakeasies, illegal bars, often hidden in basements or behind legitimate businesses, flourished in every major city. Organized crime boomed as gangsters like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and Dutch Schultz made fortunes smuggling and selling alcohol. Violence increased dramatically as criminal organizations fought for control of the lucrative bootlegging trade. The St. Valentine's Day massacre and similar incidents horrified the public. Government lost enormous tax revenue from legal alcohol sales, while spending vast resources on enforcement. Police and judicial systems were overwhelmed and often corrupted. Millions of otherwise law-abiding citizens became criminals simply by drinking. The quality and safety of alcohol declined as unregulated producers made dangerous batches in uncontrolled conditions. People died or went blind from poorly made moonshine. And Americans developed increasingly creative, elaborate ways to circumvent the law, from hidden distilleries to prescription alcohol to religious exemptions. By the early 1930s, it was clear that prohibition was failing. Public opinion turned against it. The Great Depression made the potential tax revenue from legal alcohol sales increasingly attractive. In 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th, ending national prohibition. But when prohibition was repealed, states didn't just throw open the doors and return to pre-1920 practices. They were cautious, even paranoid. Many state legislatures and local governments were still controlled by temperance supporters who opposed repeal. Others genuinely believed that unregulated alcohol sales had caused serious social problems before prohibition and wanted to prevent their return. The result was a massive wave of new regulations designed to control alcohol consumption without outright banning it. These regulations were meant to prevent the return of the old saloon culture that reformers blamed for pre-prohibition social problems. States required bars to serve food to ensure they were restaurants rather than dedicated drinking establishments. The theory was that people drinking while eating would consume less alcohol and behave more responsibly. Some states set minimum food revenue requirements. The business had to make a certain percentage of its income from food sales to maintain its liquor license. Regulations mandated good lighting in bars to prevent the dark, sinful atmosphere of old saloons and speakeasies, which reformers associated with immoral behavior. Bars had to be bright enough for police to see inside easily, reducing opportunities for illegal activity. Laws limited seating capacity, bar stool numbers, and standing room to discourage people from spending all day drinking. If you couldn't sit comfortably, maybe you'd leave sooner. Some jurisdictions prohibited entertainment like music or dancing in establishments that served alcohol, fearing they would become centers of vice. Restrictions on where bars could locate kept them away from schools, churches, and residential neighborhoods. Complex zoning laws created buffer zones. Some areas were designated dry, alcohol sales completely prohibited, while nearby areas were wet. Many regulations targeted bartenders specifically. They couldn't overserve customers. They couldn't give free drinks. They had to refuse service to visibly intoxicated people. In some states, they couldn't drink while working or even be seen preparing drinks. Hence, Utah's requirement that bartenders pour below a visual barrier. The idea was that watching drinks being made might encourage excessive consumption. States restricted advertising for alcohol. They limited happy hours and drink specials. They prohibited promotions that encouraged rapid or excessive consumption. They set maximum alcohol content for different types of beverages. They required specific labeling and warning notices. Many states maintained partial prohibition through dry counties, where alcohol sales remain illegal to this day. Even in wet areas, complex rules govern when, where, and how alcohol can be sold. Sunday sales are restricted. Hours are limited. Many states require bars to close at 2 a.m. or earlier. Holidays have special rules. Election days historically had alcohol restrictions, many now repealed. The result is a bewildering patchwork of regulations that can seem nonsensical to outsiders. Why can you buy beer at a gas station in California but not in Pennsylvania? Why do Louisiana bars stay open all night, while others must close at 2 a.m.? Why can you drink on the street in Las Vegas and New Orleans but not almost anywhere else? Why do some states sell liquor in supermarkets, while others require separate, state-controlled stores? The answer, almost always, traces back to Prohibition and its aftermath. Different states, different approaches to managing alcohol after the noble experiment failed. Each state's regulatory scheme reflects its particular political and cultural history with alcohol, its experience during Prohibition, and the balance of power between pro- and anti-alcohol forces when these laws were written. These regulations remain controversial. The alcohol industry lobbies constantly for relaxation of rules they see as outdated and burdensome. Public health advocates push for stricter controls to reduce alcohol-related harm. Libertarians argue for minimal government intervention in personal choices. Social conservatives want to maintain restrictions they see as protecting community values and public morals. But regardless of your position on alcohol policy, these strange regulations are a direct legacy of Prohibition. America's grandest social experiment in using law to change behavior. Its spectacular failure and the complex, cautious regulatory regime created in Prohibition's wake. Now that we've explored specific examples, let's address the bigger question. Why does America have so many outdated, bizarre laws? Why don't these get cleaned up? Why does the legal system preserve absurd regulations about ice cream, camels, Sunday card games, horse parking, and Prohibition-era bar rules that nobody enforces and everybody laughs at? The answer lies in the fundamental structure of the American legal system itself and how laws are made, kept, and removed. The United States isn't really one country legally. It's 50 separate legal jurisdictions unified under a federal government with limited, specifically enumerated powers. This is the essence of American federalism, enshrined in the Constitution. The 10th Amendment explicitly states, "The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively, or to the people." This means that unless the Constitution specifically gives the federal government authority over something, that authority belongs to state governments. In practice, this means each state functions almost like its own country when it comes to most criminal law, civil law, property law, family law, and everyday regulations. Each state has its own criminal code defining what actions are crimes and what penalties apply. Each has its own civil code governing contracts, torts, and business law. Each sets its own traffic regulations, marriage laws, property rules, and licensing requirements. What's legal in California might be illegal in Texas. What's required in New York might be prohibited in Florida. What's regulated in Illinois might be completely uncontrolled in Montana. Marijuana is a perfect modern example. Legal for recreational use in some states, legal only for medical use in others, completely illegal in still others, creating a confusing patchwork where you can be perfectly legal on one side of a state border and a criminal on the other side. This federalist system means that strange laws can flourish in one state while being unthinkable in another. A conservative religious state might maintain extensive blue laws, while a liberal state repeals them entirely. A rural state might keep horse-related regulations, while urban states don't bother. A state with strong temperance history might have complex alcohol regulations, while others are more relaxed. There's no central authority that can standardize laws across all states. The federal government can't say all states must repeal their ice cream in pocket laws, because those are state criminal statutes, outside federal jurisdiction unless they somehow involve interstate commerce or constitutional rights. Here's the fundamental problem. Repealing laws requires legislative action, and legislative action requires time, attention, political will, and opportunity cost. State legislatures have limited time. They often meet for only part of the year, sometimes just a few months. Legislators have limited attention and energy. They face hundreds of competing priorities, pressure from constituents, party politics, and the practical reality that they can only accomplish so much in a given session. So legislators focus on pressing current issues, state budgets, healthcare policy, education funding, infrastructure repair, crime control, economic development, responding to emergencies, addressing constituent complaints. These are matters that affect people's lives today, that generate news coverage, that voters care about. that can win or lose elections. Nobody wants to spend valuable legislative time, scarce political capital, and limited public attention on repealing a law about ice cream in pockets or camels on highways. It's not important, it's not enforced, it doesn't hurt anyone, it's not generating complaints from constituents. There's no organised lobby demanding repeal. The media won't cover it, except as a humorous curiosity. Voters don't care. Moreover, proposing to repeal even an obviously absurd law can create unexpected political problems. Someone might object on principle that we shouldn't be wasting time on this when we have serious issues to address. Someone else might worry about unintended consequences. Maybe that law serves some purpose we don't understand. Someone might use it as an opportunity to grandstand, add controversial amendments, or pick fights with political opponents. A simple, uncontroversial bill to repeal an obsolete law can become entangled in larger political disputes. The result is that old laws just accumulate. They sit in legal codes, forgotten by everyone except occasionally discovered by researchers, journalists, or lawyers doing deep dives into statutory history. They're like archaeological layers, preserved simply because nobody has bothered to excavate and remove them. American legal codes work through a process called accretion. New laws are added on top of old ones. Unless a new law explicitly repeals an old one, and the drafters must specifically identify the old law being repealed, both remain in effect simultaneously. Over time, this creates layers upon layers of legislation from different eras, reflecting different social priorities, different technologies, different problems, and different values. Think of it like this. Imagine you're building a house, and every generation adds a new room but never tears down or renovates old ones. Eventually, you have a house with a colonial-era parlor, a Victorian library, a 1920s speakeasy in the basement, a 1950s nuclear fallout shelter, a 1970s conversation pit, a 1990s home office, and a modern smart home addition with voice-controlled everything. The different sections don't match stylistically. They have incompatible plumbing and wiring. Doorways connect rooms from different centuries, and navigating the whole structure is confusing. That's American law, a structure built over centuries without much renovation, demolition, or unified planning. This creates what legal scholars call a legal layer cake, or sedimentary law. Stratified levels of legislation from different periods. At the bottom are colonial-era statutes, common law principles inherited from England, and early constitutional provisions from the founding era. Above that, 19th century laws about horses, dueling, frontier justice, and westward expansion. Then, Prohibition-era regulations, New Deal economic controls, and mid-20th century civil rights legislation. And on top, modern laws about internet privacy, drones, cryptocurrency, and artificial intelligence. These layers don't always interact smoothly. Sometimes old laws directly contradict new ones, creating legal confusion until courts figure out which takes precedence. Sometimes old laws create loopholes in new regulatory schemes because nobody remembered to explicitly repeal them. Sometimes old laws can technically be enforced, even though everyone forgot about them, and their application to modern situations would be absurd. The complexity of this layered system creates opportunities for what lawyers call legal archaeology, digging through old statutes to find forgotten provisions that might be relevant to current disputes. Occasionally, an enterprising lawyer will discover an obscure old law that helps their client's case or creates a defense against prosecution. So here's the practical bottom-line question. If you carry ice cream in your back pocket in Alabama, let your camel walk on a Nevada highway, play cards on Sunday in South Carolina, improperly park your horse in Texas, or violate some other strange old law, will you actually get arrested, prosecuted, and punished? What are the real-world consequences of breaking these bizarre regulations? The vast majority of these strange old laws are completely unenforced in practice. Police officers don't know about them. Prosecutors wouldn't pursue them even if police made arrests. Judges would likely dismiss them as absurd. They exist only on paper, legal fossils that nobody takes seriously. Modern law enforcement has limited resources and must prioritize. Police departments focus on real crimes that threaten public safety: violence, theft, drug trafficking, fraud, burglary, assault, domestic violence. No police department is assigning officers to watch for ice cream-related horse theft attempts or Sunday card games. No prosecutor is building a case around camel traffic violations. Even if a police officer somehow knew about one of these laws and wanted to enforce it, their supervisor would likely tell them to focus on actual police work. The department doesn't want to waste resources on ridiculous prosecutions that will make them look foolish and generate negative publicity. These laws are what legal scholars call desuetude, laws that remain on the books but have fallen into disuse. They're formally valid, technically enforceable under the letter of the law, but practically defunct through long-term non-enforcement. It's understood by everyone in the legal system that these laws are dead letters, not meant to be applied. Courts sometimes refuse to enforce laws in desuetude on the grounds that they're obsolete, that applying them would be absurd, or that long-term non-enforcement has created a reasonable expectation that they won't be applied. The legal doctrine varies by jurisdiction, but many courts will reject attempts to prosecute people under laws that haven't been enforced in decades. However, the doctrine of desuetude isn't universally accepted in American law. Some jurisdictions follow the strict rule that a law is a law until it's formally repealed, regardless of how old, ridiculous, or long unenforced it is. In these places, technically, these weird laws could be enforced if someone really wanted to. Here's where it gets interesting and potentially concerning. Occasionally, police or prosecutors will use obscure old laws as pretexts for other actions. If they want to arrest, search, or detain someone but lack clear legal grounds, they might dig up an obscure violation as justification. For example, imagine police suspect someone of serious criminal activity, drug trafficking, organized crime, money laundering. But they can't prove it yet and do not have grounds for arrest or search. They might use an obscure regulation: failure to license a horse properly, violation of a Sunday blue law, some other forgotten statute, as a technical reason to detain, question, or search the person, hoping to find evidence of the real crime they're investigating. This is called pretextual enforcement, using a minor or obscure violation as a pretext, excuse, to take action really motivated by other suspicions. It's legally questionable and often gets challenged in court. Defense attorneys argue it violates the Fourth Amendment's protection against unreasonable searches and the broader principle that laws should be enforced fairly and consistently, not selectively against people police happen to dislike. Civil liberties advocates worry about pretextual enforcement for good reason. If police can arrest anyone at any time by digging through centuries of legal codes to find some obscure violation everyone's technically guilty of, then nobody's really protected by law. Selective enforcement becomes a tool for harassment, discrimination, or suppression of unpopular people and groups. Courts have grappled with this issue, trying to balance the principle that laws should be enforced with the reality that universal enforcement of every technical violation would be impossible and unjust. The general rule is that police need reasonable suspicion, or probable cause, based on actual observed behavior, not just searching for pretexts to justify actions they want to take for other reasons. Sometimes old laws suddenly become relevant in unexpected ways. A property boundary dispute might hinge on an old easement law about horse paths that determined where roads could go. A business might be shut down for violating an obscure zoning regulation from the 1920s that nobody knew existed until a competitor complained. An inheritance might be affected by ancient common law provisions about property rights that are still technically valid. Lawyers researching cases sometimes discover these old statutes and use them creatively. It's rare, but when it happens, it can create bizarre legal situations where judges must decide whether to enforce laws that have not been applied in decades and whose application to modern circumstances seems absurd. There have been cases where someone successfully challenged a conviction or regulation by pointing to an old, contradictory law that was never repealed. There have been property disputes where someone claimed rights under century-old statutes. There have been tax cases involving obsolete exemptions or regulations. These situations are unusual, But they demonstrate that old laws aren't always completely harmless. They can occasionally have real legal consequences, creating uncertainty and complexity in the legal system. Some states have made efforts to clean up their legal codes by identifying and repealing obviously obsolete laws. Many states have law revision commissions, or similar bodies tasked with reviewing statutes, identifying outdated provisions, recommending repeals, and generally keeping the code organized and current. These commissions do useful work. They've successfully removed many genuinely obsolete laws over the years, but the process is slow, unglamorous, poorly funded, and rarely complete. For every obsolete law they identify and remove, others remain buried in the code, waiting to be discovered. Moreover, there's disagreement about what counts as obsolete. Some laws that seem ridiculous might still serve purposes. Some laws that seem outdated might have historical or cultural value worth preserving. Some laws that are rarely enforced might still be useful for occasional situations. The result is that strange old laws will probably always be with us to some degree. They're part of the character of American legal system. A feature perhaps rather than a bug, reminding us that law is a human institution with a history, not a perfectly rational system designed from scratch. So what's the real takeaway from all these strange American laws? That legislators in the past were idiots, that the legal system is fundamentally broken and dysfunctional, that Americans are too lazy or incompetent to maintain their legal codes properly. No, none of these cynical conclusions are really fair or accurate. Strange laws are time capsules. They're windows into the past, showing us what problems people faced, what they valued, what they feared, and how they tried to solve the challenges of their time. The law against ice cream in pockets tells us that horse theft was a serious, common problem that required creative solutions. The law against camels on highways reminds us of a fascinating, failed military experiment and the challenges of westward expansion. Blue laws reveal America's deep religious heritage and the powerful influence of moral reform movements. Horse parking regulations show us that cities once struggled with problems we can barely imagine. Streets literally covered in manure, traffic jams of horse-drawn vehicles, urban environments shaped entirely around animal transportation. And Prohibition-era bar regulations demonstrate how a massive social experiment in legislating morality shaped alcohol policy for generations. These laws weren't stupid when they were created. They were sensible, rational responses to real problems. They just outlived the problems they were meant to solve. The world changed. Technology advanced. Society evolved. Priorities shifted. New problems emerged. But the laws remained, frozen in legal code, like insects preserved in amber. We laugh at these laws, and we should. They're amusing, absurd, when viewed through modern eyes. They're reminders that legal systems are human creations, subject to all the quirks, mistakes, oversights, and historical accidents that characterize every human institution. But we should also recognize them for what they really are. History that got stuck in the law books, preserved not through active choice, but through passive neglect. Every strange law is a story about people trying to solve problems with the tools they had available. A story about social values and priorities that changed while the laws didn't keep pace. A story about how difficult it is to keep legal codes updated and relevant when legislators are constantly busy dealing with current crises and rarely have time to look backward and clean up old messes. When you hear about a bizarre American law, whether it's about Camel's ice cream, Sunday card games, horse parking bar regulations, or any of thousands of other strange provisions scattered through state legal codes, don't just laugh and move on. Ask yourself, what problem was this trying to solve? What does this tell us about that time and place? What has changed since then? What assumptions did lawmakers make that no longer hold true? Because strange laws aren't really about the present. They're about the past we forgot to rewrite, remove, or revise. They're archaeological layers in our legal codes, preserving moments in history when these rules made perfect sense to the people who created them. We just happen to forget the context lose the institutional memory, and move on to new concerns while the old laws remain behind. And maybe that's actually valuable in its own way. Maybe keeping these laws around, even unenforced and ridiculous, serves a purpose beyond just providing entertainment for journalists writing weird law articles. Maybe they remind us of something important, that laws are temporary responses to temporary problems, that what seems obviously right and necessary today might seem absurd tomorrow, and that legal systems are always works in progress, never finished, always carrying the accumulated weight of history, whether we realize it or not. These laws remind us that legal systems are conservative in the literal sense. They conserve, they preserve, they accumulate rather than starting fresh. They remind us that changing law is hard, that institutional inertia is powerful, that it's always easier to add new rules than to remove old ones. They remind us to be humble about our own laws and regulations. The rules we're creating today, the policies we're implementing, the problems we're solving, in 100 years, will they seem as bizarre and outdated as ice cream in pocket prohibitions seem to us? Almost certainly. Future generations will laugh at our attempts to regulate social media, manage artificial intelligence, control cryptocurrency, address climate change, or whatever else we're struggling with. They'll wonder what we were thinking, why we approached problems the way we did, why we didn't see obvious solutions that will be clear to them with hindsight. So yes, American laws can be strange. They can be bizarre, outdated, absurd, and laughable. But they're not stupid. They're just old. And in their strangeness, they tell us something true and important about how societies change, how laws lag behind social evolution, and how history refuses to stay buried, even when we'd prefer to forget it. The next time you encounter a weird American law, remember, you're not just seeing a legislative mistake or an absurd rule. You're seeing history. You're seeing a problem that mattered deeply to people who are now long dead. You're seeing evidence that our legal system is built on layers of past attempts to create order, justice, and safety. You're seeing proof that law is a living, evolving human institution that carries its history forward, for better or worse. And that, ultimately, is what makes these strange laws valuable. Not because they serve any current purpose, they don't, but because they connect us to our past, remind us that we're part of a continuing story, and teach us humility about our own certainties and the laws we create today that future generations will probably laugh at tomorrow. Strange laws aren't a flaw in the American legal system. They're a feature. They're history lessons embedded in legal code. They're reminders that law is human, that humans make mistakes, that societies change faster than statutes, and that the past is always with us, whether we acknowledge it or not. So the next time someone tells you about a ridiculous American law, don't just laugh. Think about the story behind it. Because that story is part of your story too.